Okay, so today's daf yomi is Bava Metzia Tzadiches. Bava Metzia 98. The daf yomi is dedicated for a shmir for Am Yisrael, Hatzalah for the Shvuyim, Yeshua for the Chayalim. And on today's day, we're also going to give thanks like we do every day to Hashem, but today is the day of Yom Yerushalayim, recognition of the fact that the Jewish people had a major victory. It brought us closer to the base of Mikdash on this date in 1967. So the Mishnah back on Sadi Zayin Amabez had told us about a case, four cases. The first case where the borrower had borrowed a cow for half a day and rented it for half a day, and then the cow died, and we don't know if it was during the time of the borrower or in the rental. And the person who lent it claimed it happened during the time of the borrowing, and the borrower says, I don't know. So under that case, we say that the borrower has to pay. The second case is where the renter says the rental one died. The renter says it died, that was the rental. Whereas the borrower says, I don't know, then he's going, no, excuse me, where the lender says, I don't know, then he's going to be exempt. The third case is each one makes their own claim. The borrower says it happened during the time of the rental, and the lender says it happened during the time of the borrower. So then the renter takes an oath that the rented one is the one that died, and he's going to be exempt. Now, in the fourth case is each one says, I don't know, then they split it. So the Gemara says, so going back to the first case where the lender says the one I lent to you dies, and the borrower says, I don't know, Shmas Mina, we learned from here, and Manu Biyadcha, that if a person says, you owe me $100, and the other one says, I don't know, he's chayiv, that he's going to be liable. And this is the principle Rashi tells us called Bari Vishema, Bari Adif. If one person makes a claim of certainty and the other one makes a claim of uncertainty, this certain claim is the one that will carry the day. That's the first case of our Mishnah. So it seems that's very clear, Bari Vishema, Bari Adif. So this must be a refutation of Rav Nachman's principle, because Rav Nachman seems to argue with this idea of Bari V'Shema Bari Adaf, because the Rav Nachman learns Zimar Manuli Biyadcha V'Hala Omar Any Yodeya. He says, you owe me $100. He says, I don't know. Rav Huna, Rav Yehuda, Amir Chayev. Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda say that's the case of Bari V'Shema Bari Adaf. He's going to be responsible to pay. Whereas Rav Nachman and Rav Yochanan Amri Pater, Rav Nachman and Rav Yochanan say is exempt. Kida Amar Rav Nachman. So the Gemara says, well, how would Rav Nachman explain the fact that he's contradicting our Mishnah? Because our Mishnah seems to be saying Bar V'Shem and Bar Yadiv. So, and Rav Nachman says that you'd be exempt there. So the Gemara explains, Kida Amar Rav Nachman, when she is Asik Shvua B'neim. No, Rav Nachman says the case of our Mishnah is where the borrower is responsible to take an oath, and he's not able to take an oath because he says, I don't know. And so therefore, that's why he has to pay. If it would be a pure case of Bari V'Shema, then indeed we would say that we don't give the just because you have a certain claim doesn't carry the day. But in this case, he can't take an oath. And so since he can't take an oath, therefore we're going to say that he has to pay. So the Gemara says, well, what's this case? Like Rava taught, the Rava, the Amar Rava, we're going to get to this, God willing, at the end of our Masechta. Rava says, Manoli Biyatcha. Rava says, you owe me $100. Vahala Omar Elcha Biyadi Elcha Mishim. And the other one says, no, you only owe me 50. Vashar Eni Odea. And the remaining parts, I have no idea what it's worth. So Rava says, you owe me $100. The other one says, I only owe you 50. So that's a case of Moed B'Mikzas. Is a partial admission. But the rest, he says, Eni Odea. And the rest, he says, I don't know. So mitoch she'enu yachol mishaveh, because he can't take an oath about the remaining part, because he says, I don't know. So therefore, he has to pay mishalim. So therefore, he has to pay. So that's what's going on in this case. He's making a claim, and so therefore, he has. We're going to see how is in our case a case of a partial admission, but that's what Rava says. And if the case of a partial admission, where you would have to take an oath, but in this case, since you can't take an oath, therefore we have to pay, because one of the three times where there's a biblical oath is a case of partial admission, what's called Bava Metzia. And so therefore, since he can't take the oath in this case, because he says, I don't know about the rest, therefore he has to pay. And so how do we have that in our case? Because how is our case a partial admission? It seems to be like there's only one cow in question. So how is our case a case where there's a partial admission and he says, I don't know? So the Gemara explains, Mishkachas Reisha. Well, we're going to have it in the first case. Remember, the first case was and where there was one cow. But we're going to say that really it wasn't one cow. That's the way we assumed it, but that was just a superficial reading of our Mishnah. Actually, when we read our Mishnah in this context, it's clear that in the first case there were two cows, and in the second case there were three cows. The Reish of a Beis, the Sefer Begimel. How is the first case having two cows? Reish of a Beis, the Amalei Beis Peiros Masar Tilchai says, the lender says, I gave you two cows. Palgi the Yoma B'Shelo, Palgi the Yoma B'Shchiros. Half the day was a loan and half the day was a rental. Or one day was a loan and one day was a rental. And both of them are died. So therefore, both of them died. Both of them died during the time that they were being borrowed. Whereas the borrower says, he says, yeah, indeed, one died during the loan. So that's a partial admission. V'idach lo yadana. And the other one, I don't know. So it's a partial admission, and he can't take an oath because he says, I don't know about the other one. So that's exactly this case. He says, I don't know if the other one died during the loan or the rental. So he can't take an oath. Because he can't take an oath, therefore he has to pay. And the Seifa, the next clause, is talking about Gimel. It's talking about three. It's talking about three. The Amalei Gimel Paros Nasati. He says, I gave you three cows, Beis B'She'ela v'Achas B'Schiros. Two were a loan, and one was a rental. So, and then they died. Umeisu Hani Tarti D'She'ela. And these two cows that I lent to you died. And the borrower says, I'm going to show in Chada D'She'ela Mesa. One of them really did die during the loan, so that's a partial admission. The other one, I don't know which one is alive and which one died. If it was the one that was borrowed or the one that was rented out. So it's a mode of a miktas, it's a partial admission, but the other one he says, I don't know. So since he can't take an oath, Misham, he has to pay. So the Gemara says, okay, that works well according to Rava's explanation. But what about according to Rami Bar Chama, who we learned in Bava Kama, we learned earlier? He says in order that according to Rami Bar Chama, whose position is that in order to do a biblical oath, biblically speaking, whether it's by a case of a partial admission or a case of Shvuas HaShomrim, you need to say not only a partial admission, but also a partial denial. You need to have a denial there as well. This is a dispute from Bava Kama where it says in the passage, it is about whether we say Erev Parshios. So basically, I'm just going to go through this so everyone can hold it. We're just going to go back onto Rami Bar Chama's position. It says in Bava Kama, Kov Zayin Amud Aleph, it says in the passage of Shomer Chinam about an unpaid watchman, it says Asher Yomar Ki Huzeh. That's the key phrase. It says because it is this, Ad Elohim Yavot Varshem. You need to come to the court. So we see that the Torah obligates that there be an oath in the case where the person who was claimed, where the defendant says Ki Huzeh, meaning to say he has a partial admission. And so what is that partial admission doing amongst the Shvuas HaShomrim? So Rami Bar Chama's of the position that this verse refers to the Shomer, that it refers to the watchman. Ki Huzeh, it implies that you need both a denial and an admission. And so therefore the verse is teaching us that the watchman does not take a Shvuas HaShomrim unless his claim includes both a denial and an admission. Meaning to say, aside from the fact that he needs to swear about the animal that was deposited from him, there needs to be two other animals that one of them he says never was here, and the other one he says that he has to pay. So therefore, it needs to be three animals in that case in the Torah. One he denies it. He denies he has to take an oath. One of them he has to take an oath that he wasn't negligent, and then the other one he says never existed, and the other one he says yes, I have to pay. So he needs his claim about the animal in question, about the one who was the question. Another one he needs to completely deny, and the other one he needs to completely admit. But Rav Chia Bar Yosef, so that's the position of Rami Bar Chama. But Rav Chia Bar Yosef there says that this verse is not referring to Shomer. It's Erev Parshos. Means to say Kuzeh only implies a partial admission. And so therefore, if he admits to part of the claim, then he has to take an oath. So now we go back to our Gemara. Rami Bar Chama says there needs to be a denial and an admission, and also we need to have the denial about the watching this specific animal. So according to Rami Bar Chama, the Amar Dalad Shomrim Tzrichin Kfira, he says that the four watchmen require not only a moda b'miktas, but also a kofer b'miktas, moda b'miktas. So mishkachas. So what's the scenario of our Mishnah? So we're going to have to add an animal in each case. Reisha b'gimel v'seif b'dal. The first clause is with 3, and the second clause is with 4. Reisha b'gimel. The first clause is with 3 animals. The Amrway Gimel paras asadicha. I gave you 3 cows. Palga b'yoma b'sheu. Palga b'yoma b'tzirus. Half the day is a loan and half the day is a rental. Or 1 day is a loan and 1 day is a rental. Umeisu gimel and the person who makes the claim says all 3 died during the loan. And the borrower says, he says one of them never existed. He denies it. And one of them died during the loan. So he admits that. The other one, I don't know. So he has denial, admission, and I don't know. And so since he can't take an oath, therefore he has to pay. And what is the seifa? And the seifa is bedawad. And the second clause has to deal with 4 animals. I gave you 4 cows. Gimel b'she'ela. 3 were alone, and chada b'sliris, and 1 was a rental. And the 3 that were loaned out died. The Amrle show, and the borrower says on the top of 98b, this is Rami Bachami's position. Yes, say one of them never existed. In the She'ela Mesa, and one of them, that was the borrowed one that died. So that's a partial admission. Either Slira Mesa with the Kaima, or the She'ela Mesa with the Kaima, with the Kaima, the Sliras. And then the other one, I don't know if the one that was rented is the one that died, and the one that's still in existence is the borrowing one, or the borrowed one is the one that died, and the one that still existed is the rental one. Since he can't take an oath there, he'd have to pay. That's Rami Bar Chama's position. It says we need another one which he has to completely deny and say, Lo hayidvar me'olam. So now we're up to the next line in the Mishnah, that the second case of the Mishnah was one person claims it was borrowed, the other one claims it's rented. Then the rental has to swear that this rental one is the one that died, and then it'll be exempt. But why is he have to swear there? Why don't we say Mashatanu? Hodolo? He made a claim to him about a borrowed one, and he says, I admit to you that about the rented one. Why does he have to swear there at all? Mashahodo Otano, that which he makes an admission on was not what he claimed. So Amar Ua, Ayde Gilgal. So Gilgal is what we have to take it off. What is a Gilgal? So first of all, we have this concept called a Gilgal Neshama. That's something Ramchal talks about, that the soul comes back in different forms. But here we're talking about a Gilgal of the oath, that once you have to take an oath that it was a rental and not a borrowed one, then once you have to do that, then you could also take an oath about this specific case. The Amrle Ishtabisli Ezumios the Kedarka Mesa, meaning to say, you could say to the person who claims it was a rental, okay, take your oath about the rental, that it was a that the rental animal died through an accident. Once he has to take an oath, once he takes their oath that it died in this normal manner, he should then also have to take an oath that it was the rented one that died and not the borrowed one. So now up to the next line of the Mishnah, each one claims, I don't know. So that's the last case of the Mishnah. Each one claim the last case of the Mishnah is each one claims, I don't know. So under those circumstances, hold on one second. So if each one claims, I don't know, then you split him. Amani, this is the position of whom? Of Sumchasi. The Amar Maman Amutu Basafik Holkin. Sumcha's position is that if there's money that's in doubt, you split it. So the Gemara says we had that position of Sumchas, we had it in Bava Kama several times. So by Rabbi Abba Bar Mamo. Rabbi Abba Bar Mamo's case asks as follows. So let's say She'ela Babalim and Sachra Shalom Babalim. Let's say you borrowed it and the owner was with you when you borrowed it, in which case you'd be exempt. And Sachra Shalom Babalim. But then after you had borrowed it, you transferred the loan into a rental. And that owner wasn't working for you at that point. Mao, do we say mi amrin and shelo chudel kaima usteros chudel kaima? We say that the loan was its own thing and the rental was a totally separate thing. And even though Rashi formulates it, even though when he initially dragged the cow into his possession, that was under the owner was working for him at that time, and then he doesn't do another mashicha because when he rents it, it was already in his possession. And so therefore, he just had to verbalize it. And so therefore, do we say at that time that it's a new transaction or the same transaction? Or do we say that since all of the obligations of the renter, i.e. if it's lost or stolen, they all exist by the borrower as well, and therefore the renter is not adding anything, and so that's why the first Mashiach, the first transaction carries over. And so therefore he'd be exempt. And imtim salomar, so the Gemara says, and if you want to say, if you want to say, well, the rental follows from the borrowing, and so therefore he doesn't need to do a new transaction. Let's say you rented it with the owner being there, and then you borrowed it without the owner being there. So, Mao, do we say there, She'ela b'sichras v'adelo shchicha? Do we say that since by v'adelo shaycha, that borrowing is not shayach to renting, because renting has less limitations, so you'd have to do a new kinyan to take upon yourself the obligations of a borrower. Or do we say, no, since you have some partial overlap between a borrower coming from a renter, meaning to say the geneva v'aveda and the negligence. So therefore, also you're going to have to pay. You don't need a new kinyan, and if you go from renting to borrowing, we extend the leniency of the owner being with you. But now, Gemara asks the next question. She'ela b'balam. Let's say you borrowed it with the owner. V'sachar shelo b'balam, and then you rented it without the owner. The chazar v'shala, and then you go back and you borrowed it with the owner. Mao, what would you say there? Do we say we return the original loan to its initial place? You don't need a new kinyan, and therefore you're exempt from the fact that the owner was with you. Or maybe the rental interrupted between the initial kinyan of the borrowing, and so therefore we can't assume that the extension, the limitation of the owner being with you should still apply. Then we have the fourth case, Sachar b'balam v'sha'ala v'chazav v'sachra. Let's say you rented it with the owner being there, and then you go back. Let's say you rented it with the owner, and then you go back and you borrowed it, and you went back and you rented it again. There, do we say the initial rental returned to its place? Or maybe the borrowing interrupted it. So Gemara says we're going to leave that question, we'll leave this question unresolved. So now we come up to the Mishnah. Hashoyel es hapara v'shocholo biyad beno biyad avdo. So let's say a person borrows a cow, and the lender sends it to him, sends it to the borrower through the hand of his own son, biyad beno biyad avdo biyad shlucho, his son, his eved, his servant, or his agent, o biyad beno biyad avdo biyad shlucho shel shoel, or through the hands of the son or the agent or the eved of the borrower. Umeisa, and the animal dies before it actually gets to the borrower, pater. Then we're going to say that the borrower is going to be exempt if it dies on the road. So Rashi reminds us that this is a dispute between Rav and Rav Chisda in Hagozal Kama, in Bava Kama 104a. Rav Chisda says that this is the agent of the borrower, because there are no witnesses, even though he lived in his house, there were no witnesses that he's his agent. Because if there were witnesses, for sure the borrower would be responsible. Whereas Rabbah says, even if he made him an agent with witnesses, nevertheless, he didn't make him an agent to obligate him for accidents. Meaning to say that the borrower was just saying, listen, I trust this guy. If you want to send it with him, you can. But I'm not saying I'm responsible for all accidents at that point. So that's the first case of our Mishnah. The second case is Amar Shol, but if the borrower said, Shochli biyad bini, biyad avdi, biyad shluchi, or biyad bincha, biyad avdecha, biyad shluchacha, but let's say the borrower says, send it to me through the hands of my son, my eved, my agent, or your son, your eved, your agent, O Shamar Mashil, or if the lender explicitly says, Areini mishalchalach, biyad bini, biyad avdi, biyad shluchi, or biyad bincha, biyad avdecha, biyad shluchacha, v'amar shol shalach, or if the lender says explicitly, send it through the hands of my son or your son, or if the lender says, I'm going to send it through my son or your son, and the borrower says, send it, then Shochel Mesa Chayiv. Then, since he has explicitly taken upon himself the obligations, then he's going to be responsible. And the reverse also works. At the time when the borrower wants to return it, then he needs to be explicit, and the lender needs to be explicit. So therefore, that is our mission. We can go on a little bit more. I'm just going to stop the recording because this is the vort for today's daf. Let me just stop the recording.